A sea swarming with life, abundance beyond belief. When Europeans first sailed into the New World, they discovered a primeval ocean, a virgin paradise reaching all the way from Labrador to Cape Cod. What would the first European explorers of these Atlantic coasts think if they could see them today? Where are the wheeling flights of seabirds that once filled the skies, they would wonder? Where are the legions of walrus and seals on all the endless beaches? Where are the spouting pods of greater and lesser whales surging through a living tide of fishes? The early explorers believed these multitudes were infinite. They saw them as a storehouse of riches ready for the taking. The bonanza of the sea was the foremost New World discovery. It sustained early settlement, gave rise to immensely profitable enterprises, and has been the wellspring of fortune after fortune. Wealth without end, and always another living treasure to plunder. This is the story of our impact on the Western Atlantic and its bordering shores, of how we have turned a sea of life into a sea of slaughter. There are still a few places, a very few, where one can find a remnant of the teeming multitudes which so astounded our ancestors. Surviving seabirds still flock annually to a handful of islands like this one to lay their eggs and raise a new generation. Funk Island, off Newfoundland, nurtures one of the largest remaining seabird colonies in North America. The great white gannets are outnumbered by a myriad of common murres, all crowded onto a few hectares of bald rock. This scene would have been familiar to Jacques Cartier, who in 1535 described one seabird colony as being so exceedingly full of birds that all the ships of France might load a cargo of them without anyone noticing that any had been removed. Such an extraordinary concentration of seabirds was sustained by vast schools of small fishes, thriving in the cold, nutrient-rich waters of what used to be one of the most productive seas in the world. Legions of larger fishes, together with countless other creatures, abounded in these rich waters. But it was the cod that so excited many of the first explorers. John Cabot claimed the schools were so immense you could scoop the fish out in baskets. The cod fishery quickly became the main focus of activity in the New World. Early maps pinpointed the exact location and shape of the offshore banks, the shallower parts of the continental shelf where cod were thickest. The greatest of these were the Grand Banks of Newfoundland. Although this banked schooner was filmed 70 years ago, fishing methods then were essentially the same as those used centuries earlier. First, the fishing grounds had to be located. Soundings were taken with a lead weight until the right depth and kind of bottom were found. Then the bait was cut and secured to hook and lines. It was as simple as that. By 1600, as many as 650 European vessels were fishing New World waters. During an average season, the fleet would catch over 350,000 tons of cod. One contemporary account declared that these banks are true mines, more valuable than the gold mines of Peru and Mexico. Until this century, the entire catch was preserved with salt. At first, the cod was simply skinned, boned, salted, and packed wet in the ship's holds for the voyage back to Europe. The quality of the catch could be improved by drying the salted fish ashore. And so shore stations began to spring up around good harbors. The first real European footholds in Atlantic Canada and New England. Salted and dried cod soon became a staple food throughout much of Europe. Hundreds of thousands of tons of fish were brought across the Western Ocean every year for centuries. Little wonder that men thought the supply was inexhaustible. Wherever they fished, early Europeans saw other sources of enormous profits. Whales were so abundant, they were considered a hazard to navigation. This was one of the most numerous of the leviathans, the black right whale. It was called right because it was slow-moving, floated when killed, and the thick blubber encasing the body produced up to 15,000 liters of oil. Only the bowhead whale, a larger cousin, was more desirable, and it too was then enormously abundant from the Gulf of St. Lawrence northward. Basque whalers from Spain and France were exploiting this bounty as early as 1500. Having exterminated right whales in their home waters, they began a systematic slaughter in the coastal waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Newfoundland, and Labrador. Once a bowhead or right whale was killed, the carcass was towed to a nearby shore station. By the mid-16th century, there were as many as 50 of these giant butcher shops. The blubber was stripped off and rendered into oil that fueled the lamps of Europe and was also used for making soap and tanning leather. Profits were immense, making this industry the Exxon of the times. By the end of the 16th century, when the Basque fleet was largely destroyed, it was part of the ill-fated Spanish Armada. At least 100,000 bowhead and right whales had died. The damage was done. The remnant bowheads now exist only in Arctic waters. The black rights number no more than 300, the rarest of North Atlantic whales. Every summer, they congregate off Nova Scotia to reproduce their kind. Although now protected, their rights show few signs of recovery. Despite their own best efforts, these great creatures may yet be doomed. By the mid-18th century, a fleet of up to 100 New England whalers was operating in the North Atlantic. They had exterminated the coast-loving Atlantic gray whales, but sperm whales were still innumerable. Sperms were especially valued for a treasure occasionally found in the digestive tract, ambergris. As a medicine and a base for perfumes, it was literally worth its weight in gold. The hunt for sperm whales led to open sea whaling, no longer tied to shore stations. These scenes from a silent melodrama show how it was done. First, the boat crews had to get close enough to plant a barbed harpoon, making the whale fast to the boat. When the whale had exhausted itself towing the boat, long lances were used to bleed it to death. In deep-sea whaling, the oil was rendered out aboard the ships. Sometimes a rare bowhead or right whale was also killed. Its mouth was full of baleen, flexible plates which were in great demand for corsets, buggy whips, and other vitally important goods. A particularly valuable oil was baled out of the sperm whale's head. It burned with a brilliant, odorless flame and was the finest lubricant available in those times. Deep-sea whalers worked the waters nearest home until, by about 1800, sperm whales were scarce and right whales had virtually vanished from the sea of slaughter. Having perfected their gory business here, they ventured farther afield until the fires beneath their cauldrons burned day and night in every ocean of the world. The seas were being drained of life, but so were the bordering shores. Domestic horses now graze where wild sea cows once covered the beaches. We tend now to equate great empty places with wilderness, but as with the Magdalen Island beaches here in the Gulf, the emptiness is often of our own making.
When French and Basque whalers reached the Magdalen Islands at the beginning of the 16th century, they found the waters around the islands literally swarming with the gigantic creatures that we call walrus, and they called sea cows. This old gentleman whose skull is beside me here was one of them. When the French and the Basques went ashore, they were really astounded by what they discovered. Almost every beach was paved with walrus, and there are nearly 100 miles of beaches on these islands. As far as the eye could see, these great creatures were lying on the beaches, digesting the gargantuan dinners of shellfish and crustacean from the rich waters around here, making love and having their young, or just lying there in the sun enjoying themselves.
Today, walrus exist only in the Arctic. But 400 years ago, the Gulf of St. Lawrence was home to over 250,000 of the great sea tuskers, and almost as many lived on Sable Island and south as far as Cape Cod. Walrus were a living treasure for their oil, their tusks, which were twice as valuable as elephant ivory, and their exceedingly tough leather. Fatally vulnerable, the vast herds were soon attacked. Basques, French, and then the English kept up an unrelenting carnage. One crew of Bostonians killed 25,000 in the Magdalen Islands in just 1 year. Other New Englanders, together with local settlers, joined in what had become an unchecked massacre, everyone grabbing for a share of the profits before the inevitable end.
When word of this finally reached the authorities, they sent a Royal Navy lieutenant to investigate. He arrived here in 1799. He came too late. In his report, he stated that the walrus on the Magdalene Islands had been annihilated. He was not quite right. Some 20 years later, a single walrus bull was seen on the southern beaches. None have been seen since. None will ever be seen here again.
By the late 16th century, New World settlement was taking root. Ships were no longer all returning to Europe for the winter. There was wild food on land, but the early settlers lived mostly off the sea. In Newfoundland, the run of capelin onto the beaches was a summer bounty. The little fish were dried, salted, used for bait, even rendered into oil. They were also used as livestock feed and to manure the soil. The seasonal runs of many fish species and their untold millions were the chief sustenance of settlements through many generations. A few fish weirs still operate in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Some families have worked these same sites for 3 centuries, but their ancestors would have considered present catches hardly worth the effort. One of the few kinds of fishes still numerous enough to be worth taking are the eels. But now, even this fishery faces an uncertain future. Pollution has made the eel's flesh too toxic to be saleable in most countries. Many fish, including eels, migrate from the ocean into fresh water to lay their eggs or to mature. Their numbers were once astronomical. Salmon were so abundant that during the last century, New Brunswick alone was exporting over 500,000 kilograms a year. Today, in most rivers, the great runs are only a memory. Atlantic sturgeon have been decimated almost to the vanishing point. Weighing up to half a ton, these slow-growing giants were unable to withstand the slaughter for meat and caviar. River-spawning fishes were victims of human greed, but also of what we call progress. Early industry was mostly powered by water wheels, and each new dam across a river barred the fishes from reaching their spawning grounds. Even the relatively few that did manage to fight their way upstream and spawn often failed to reproduce their kind. Spawning beds were torn apart by logging runs. Erosion clogged them with silt, or they were blown up to free log jams. Those fishes still swimming upstream from the sea today represent no more than 5% of their original numbers. As people multiplied along our coasts, they made ever greater use of the sea. More and more inlets and harbors were occupied, and less room remained for creatures of the coast. Only a few species, mainly scavengers like these gulls, have benefited from our presence. Most weren't so lucky, and there were some residents for whom we had no tolerance at all. This superb animal was known in early times as the water bear. Early accounts confirm that these bears, now called polar bears and confined to the Arctic, once ranged as far south as Nova Scotia. In the early days, they would sometimes steal drying cod, and that was enough to doom them. But their thick pelts and fat rendered into oil were also worth good money. If these weren't reasons enough, Polar bears were killed on sight simply because that's what we did and still do to large carnivores. Along the north shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the land and climate are especially harsh. In such areas, early settlement was almost completely sustained by the sea, and the several species of seals were the single most valuable resource. This way of sealing has remained virtually unchanged for 300 years. It's based on the winter arrival of vast herds of harp seals migrating from the Arctic into the Gulf. This business proved so lucrative that by 1720, shore sealing had spread all the way to northern Labrador and along the west coast of Newfoundland. Seal blubber proved to be almost as profitable as that of whales and walrus. Shore stations filled the air with the stench of boiling oil, and by the mid-1700s, over 20,000 seals were being killed each year. This was slim pickings compared to what would come later, when 5 million whelping seals were discovered on the pack ice of the Gulf and off the coasts of Newfoundland. Every March, the mighty harp seal nation pupped on these floating nurseries where they were safe from most enemies. Here the young seals suckled in peace, putting on as much as 50 pounds in less than 2 weeks. Then they were on their own, having stored enough blubber to insulate and feed them until they took to sea. Harp seals share the breeding ice with the larger but much less numerous hood seals, so named for the male's inflatable nasal sacs. Lovemaking amongst the hoods is rougher than with the harps, but both kinds mate as soon as the pups are weaned. About the end of March, all the seals abandon the ice and migrate north to high Arctic waters. Through millenniums, the pristine world of shifting ice sheltered the young of both harp and hood seal nations. But about 1750, Newfoundlanders discovered this sanctuary, and then the ice ran red.
First, sailing vessels and later steam vessels began going to the ice every year. Many of them came from outports, but in the end, most of them sailed from St. John's, which became the heart and center of the sealing industry.
In one given year, 560,000 pelts were brought ashore here. Most of them were young seals, or whitecoats as they're called, and the sale of them made many merchants on Water Street into millionaires. However, it was a brutal business, no matter how you looked at it. In another year, 50 schooners were lost at the ice. But for the seals, every year was a year of ongoing bloody slaughter. In the so-called great days of sealing, a horde of vessels left about the end of February and raced for the pack ice in the Gulf and at the front, northeast of Newfoundland, each hoping to be first into the main patch. An army poured out onto the ice, each individual impelled by a single purpose, to kill every seal that could be found, whether baby or adult. This was unbridled massacre. Pregnant and nursing females suffered equally with the newborn pups. And for every seal landed, at least one more was lost or abandoned in bad weather. During the peak years of the last century, as many as 26 million seals were butchered at the ice. The watchword of the sealers was, "Leave nothing for the devil." The demand for seal products was outstripping the supply. The main profit was in the oil, but some skins were also sold. Even the fur of unborn harp seals was used to make muffs and stoles. This butchery suffered a setback during the First World War, when men were preoccupied killing each other. There was an interlude of peace at the ice after more than a century of continuous carnage. The 19th century was just as destructive to seabirds as to seals. This teeming colony at Funk Island off Newfoundland was at one point almost wiped out. The destruction began with the first explorers. After months of salt beef and hard biscuit, the half-starved seamen reacted to these colonies like weasels in a chicken coop. Soon, every passing vessel was loading up with seabirds for human food and as bait for the cod fisheries. During some seasons, hardly a young bird reached maturity. By 1900, well over 3/4 of all Western Atlantic colonies had been wiped out or reduced to remnant populations. An exploding market for seabird eggs was particularly destructive. Crews from as far as Boston would go from colony to colony, breaking every egg they could find. By the time they returned 2 weeks later, most birds had laid a second clutch, guaranteed fresh. Most did not lay for a third time, and so produced no young that year. To make matters worse, 19th century fashion fell in love with feathers, to decorate hats and to stuff pillows and comforters. Terns, gannets, even gulls were killed in such numbers that by the turn of the century, many species had become rarities. In some places, seabirds are still being slaughtered at their breeding colonies. Icelanders kill about 200,000 puffins every year. North Americans no longer allow seabirds to be butchered at their summer breeding colonies, but over 500,000 murres are shot in Newfoundland waters every winter, a serious threat to their survival and a reminder that our sins are not all in the past. The apparent vitality of Canada's few surviving rookeries can be misleading. Water pollution and oil spills may yet wipe out these last fragile oases of seabird life. We have nature's resilience to thank for the species that have survived, but some did not. The giant cousin of these razorbills will never be seen again. This original penguin, so named by early sailors, was the largest North Atlantic seabird. We know it as the great auk. It was killed for fat, meat, eggs, and feathers. Fully adapted to life in the ocean, the great auk couldn't fly, so it was very vulnerable when it came ashore each spring on isolated islands to raise its young.
When Jack Cartier visited the Bird Rocks in the center of the Gulf of St. Lawrence in the 16th century, he found them literally covered with great auks and these magnificent gannets that are still around us today. He sent his men ashore with a longboat, and in about an hour, they killed and loaded 1,000 great auks. And they said later that they could have killed enough to fill 30 boats in that length of time if they'd wanted to do it. By about 1750, the great auks had been eliminated from these islands, and shortly thereafter, they had pretty well disappeared from the whole of the Atlantic coast. As they became really rare, the last few were sought after for museum specimens. They became extremely valuable. And the last known pair of great auks were killed on an island off Iceland about 1844 for museum collections. Thereafter, no more were ever seen, and this magnificent bird, which once was the king of the North Atlantic, had vanished forever from man's ken.
In addition to the bounty provided by seabird colonies, there were also vast flocks of migrating waterfowl to be exploited every spring and every fall. The tidal flats at Cap Tomont, Quebec, have always been a major stopover for snow geese. It's autumn, and these birds have flown almost 3,000 kilometers from their Arctic breeding grounds. Now they must fatten up before continuing south. Snow geese have made something of a recovery, but in 1900 there were hardly any left after 300 years of hunting by settlers, commercial gunners, and people calling themselves sportsmen. Toward the end of the last century, something in the order of 8 million waterfowl were being killed every year. Increasing affluence had given people leisure time, and one of the most popular diversions was hunting for sport. This often meant shooting at anything that moved, as the trophies of this hunt attest. Nothing was safe from the sportsman. Just 4 of them took almost 3,000 kilograms of salmon in one season. Hunting for pleasure, combined with the losses to settlement and commerce, left all too few survivors. Migrating shorebirds once covered every coastal beach like an endless feathered cape. And sportsmen did not overlook even the smallest of these, hardly larger than sparrows. The numbers killed, often just for target practice, were beyond counting. After all, such immense flocks were inexhaustible. This is an Eskimo curlew. Their enormous flocks once rivaled those of the fabulous passenger pigeons, until they too came under the hunter's gun. And then they were massacred for sport and for profit. Hundreds of thousands went weekly to city markets. By 1900, the species was almost extinct. The beautiful Labrador duck suffered the same fate, except that it was totally destroyed by hunters' guns. Many other kinds of waterfowl would have followed it into extinction had we not imposed, belatedly, some rules and regulations on hunting. But those controls have not been all that effective.
As soon as we get finished with the reservation holders, we'll start working up.
In North America, shooting waterfowl is still so popular that in some places licenses are issued by lottery. How can anyone call it sport? To put on battle dress, seek out something that is beautiful and defenseless, then launch an armed attack.
Okay, Jim, here's yours. Okay.
To me, this is terrorism without cause. In addition to the direct kill, some 2 million waterfowl die annually of lead poisoning when they swallow some of the thousands of tons of shot pellets that rain down every year. Laws enacted in this century have saved most kinds of waterfowl from total extinction. However, much of today's effort to preserve the survivors is done by and for those who get pleasure and profit from hunting them. With this kind of conservation, many species still face an uncertain future. One victim after another, we keep finding new ways to drain the life from the sea. And we leave behind the abandoned relics of our selfish folly. As the rights and bowheads became rare, whaling began to focus on the humpback, the slowest member of the rorquals, another family of great whales. The other rorquals, like these 20-meter finbacks, were too fast for sailing ships to catch, and even if they could be killed, would sink beyond recovery. Rorquals include the largest animal ever to live on this planet. Blue whales have reached a length of 30 meters and weights of over 100 tons. They can cruise effortlessly at speeds that leave sailing vessels far behind. Watching the abundant blue whale and its swift cousins was sheer frustration for the early whalers. Up to 12,000 liters of oil just going to waste. But the age of steam was to change all that. In the 1880s, Norwegians launched the first industrial attack on the rorquals. Fast, steam-driven killer boats began prowling the Atlantic, able to overtake and kill even the largest creature on the planet. A cannon did the dirty work. It was designed to fire a heavy harpoon deep into the whale's vitals. A bomb in the nose of the harpoon then exploded. Two or three shots might be needed to finish off a large blue or fin. The dying could take hours. Slow, excruciating death. A powerful winch hauled the corpse to the surface. Compressed air was pumped into the carcass to keep it afloat, while it was towed back to shore for butchery. By 1911, 26 Norwegian shore stations had sprung up all along the Atlantic coast from Nova Scotia to Labrador. This was machine-age whaling, efficient and insatiable. By the start of World War II, countless thousands of large rorquals had been turned into oil and fertilizer. As one whaler joked, we put every inch of the whale to profit, except the spout. After a hiatus during World War II, whaling resumed with a vengeance. Norwegians, Newfoundlanders, Canadians, and Japanese competed fiercely for every whale that could be found. Not until 1972, when there were too few whales left to turn a profit, did the Canadian government agree to shut down its share of the industry. This is how it all ended. This whaling station was a slaughterhouse for the great whales for almost 50 years. It was abandoned in 1972. The whales were gone, their killers had departed. The whalers did nothing to preserve the living resources upon which their industry depended. On the contrary, they brought the great whales to the verge of extinction. Greed preserves only greed. And this is a monument to human greed. Fortunately for the surviving whales, there is now more money to be made watching than killing them. And since the 1972 ban, some species, such as these boisterous humpbacks, have been increasing in numbers. International agreement now affords nominal protection to the remaining stocks of whales, and most North Atlantic countries have given up whaling. But two nations continue. During the last decade, Icelanders have killed over 3,000 large whales, and the Norwegians have concentrated on the minke, the smallest of the rorquals. The minke whale was long ignored because of its relatively small 9 meters size. But when the great whales were nearly gone, the minke had to fill a new market for frozen meat. The minke population has been decimated, and the killing continues. The minke catch has declined drastically, but as often happens, this has only increased its value. The meat is now prized as a gourmet special. Economic progress is based on developing new ways to turn a profit from all available resources. And as long as whales can be killed, we will find a use for them. The largest consumers of whales today are the Japanese. They have played a major role in the whale's destruction everywhere, and they continue to threaten their ongoing survival. In the late 1970s, a Japanese company lobbied, without success, to have the Canadian whaling ban lifted in Atlantic waters. All whales still face an uncertain future. One other family of smaller whales remains to be mentioned. It includes species such as these 8-ton orcas and the sleek, elegant dolphins. As long as oil was the main commodity, these little whales were considered a poor last choice. But the fate of one of their kind is further proof that, where there are animals to kill, we'll find ingenious new ways to convert them into profits. When the Norwegians established a whaling station at the foot of Trinity Bay, not far from here, in 1947, their prime target was the minke whale, a smaller relative of the blue and of the fin. The minke shared these waters with the little pilot whale, called pothead locally. Many years ago, I used to sail my schooner through pods of hundreds of these amazingly graceful creatures. But shortly after Newfoundland joined Canada, this tranquil beach at Tickle Cove Pond became the killing ground for most of them. What brought the pilot whales to our fatal notice was their appearance every summer in the long, narrow bays, following their favorite food, the spawning squid. For centuries, local inhabitants had killed a few now and again. But in 1951, the government of Newfoundland sponsored a brand new industry which set its sights on the pilot whale.
Excellent choice, madam.
This was to be another chapter in the bloody histories of both the fur trade and of whaling. Raising mink profitably requires a lot of cheap, high-protein feed. Western mink ranchers used wild horse meat until, having killed off the herds, they had to look elsewhere. At the same time, Newfoundland desperately wanted new enterprises. The solution to both problems was to move the mink east and feed them on what the publicity handouts called an abundant, newly discovered resource. In just one decade, the better part of 50,000 pilot whales ended up like this, as raw material for modern economic development. There was nothing modern or humane about this slaughter. It was characterized by the same brutality that has marked all our dealings with the creatures of the sea. By 1971, only 20 years after the massacre began, the pilot whale clans of Newfoundland had been virtually exterminated. We become righteously incensed when we hear that tens of thousands of elephants are being massacred for the ivory trade. But what we have done to the pilot whales is an atrocity of at least equal magnitude. Eventually, the demands of the fashion industry would also wreak havoc on the harp and hood seals. Although traditionally the skins had little commercial value, it was the oil that made men rich. Between the two world wars, oil prices stayed low. So although sealing continued, it was much reduced. This gave the seals time to make a modest recovery. In 1946, Norwegian sealers shattered this brief resurgence of vitality. There was a strong demand for animal fats in post-war Europe, and the annual harp seal kill was soon exceeding 200,000. Then Norwegian furriers discovered the equivalent of turning lead into gold, a way of tanning the skins of the pups or whitecoats so they wouldn't shed. A fashion craze for fun furs was born, and the slaughter shot skyward. Despite government assurances that there were more than enough seals to replace the astronomical numbers being killed, the awful reality was that between 1951 and 1961, the harp seal population of the Northwest Atlantic was savagely cut in half by Norwegian and Canadian sealers. The orgy of destruction continued unabated as the price of whitecoats kept rising, from $5 to $10 to $12.50. In 1962, 330,000 seals were landed. The next year, 352,000, as an ever-rising demand fueled the carnage. It was brutally obvious that the seals were headed for commercial, if not total, extinction. And just as shocking, hardly anyone seemed to care.
How world attention came to focus on the seal hunt is a rather bizarre story. Advertising people have fits about this kind of marketing blunder. It began when the Quebec government commissioned a film to boost the province's tourist trade. And the producers decided to celebrate the pioneer spirit of old French Canada, the triumph of man over nature. And they chose a little-known but highly exciting event that took place each spring on the ice off these Magdalen Island beaches. The audience reaction to that film was one of revulsion and outrage. Members of Parliament were flooded with indignant letters, and the sealing protest was born almost overnight. And the Canadian government completely underestimated the power of those bloody images of slaughter and of the movement they had spawned.
Would we go along to a maternity hospital and start clubbing all the babies there? Because this is exactly the same thing. Clubbing, picking, killing innocent creatures. They're hopeless. It's up to you, the public.
An international coalition of protest groups began to mobilize public opinion against the slaughter. Their most forceful weapon was a 1984 boycott of Canadian fish products in Britain, an economic club that had considerable effect. Protesters also produced films that conjured up images of war, of atrocities that few could stomach.
Big ships like the Polar Explorer no longer go to the ice each spring to kill seals. This is because most European countries have banned the import of baby seal pelts. But the seal hunt is by no means over. In the spring of 1988, Canadian sealers landed some 70,000 pelts, and that was twice as many as they landed the previous year. So where do things stand now? A slowdown in sealing in Canada, at least, and a temporary ban on whaling in Canadian coastal waters.
But there's no guarantee that either band will continue. Surely we should have learned by now that the seas are as vulnerable as they were once productive, as fragile as they are beautiful and diverse. For centuries, we have exploited species after species, ever more efficiently as our technology grew to match our greed. Today, no form of life is so bizarre that we may not find a use for it. And nothing demonstrates this more clearly than what we have done and are continuing to do to the fishes. The human world is now characterized by a lethal combination of exploding population and exploding appetite. Together, these create new and ever-increasing demands. Hardly anything comes out of the sea that isn't eaten by someone, somewhere.
That's fresh,
A Newfoundland fish is as likely to be sold in Tokyo as it is in Montreal. Today's demand is global and insatiable. The effects of our rapacious consumption of Atlantic fish stocks over the past 3 decades has resulted in the collapse of one species after another. We are systematically dismantling the whole marine ecosystem.
If I don't put ice, I can't sell the fish. If I put ice, the fish are fresh when fresh.
Our overweening cleverness has brought marine life to this grim state, and we are now extremely adept at converting living creatures into saleable commodities. The seas are being treated as something to be abused and exhausted for our immediate benefit. To see how this has come to pass, we must go back to the turn of the century. At that time, most of the catch was still preserved as salt. But the coming of railways, better roads, and cold storage techniques was opening up a whole new market. At first, mainly in the urban centers of the Northeast. It was now possible to ship fresh, unsalted fish hundreds of kilometers from the nearest wharf. Packing and icing fresh fillets made them more expensive than the traditional salt fish, but increasing affluence kept the market buoyant and demand rising. A new kind of fishing fleet soon began to emerge. Big vessels towing bag-like nets that engulfed whole schools of fish. More vessels and better technology resulted in immense catches for a while. Then they began to decline, yet nobody would admit that the stocks might be running out. The industry chose to believe the old saw, that there are more fish in the sea than have ever come out of it. Our escalating consumption brought catastrophic damage to the largest fish. These massive but slow-growing predators at the top of the food chain were never very numerous. Catches like this reduced the swordfish to a fraction of their former numbers, but even they were luckier than the bluefin tuna. The bluefin is now as rare as it is extraordinary. A warm-blooded colossus able to accelerate to nearly 100 kilometers an hour. Some biologists call it the superfish, a marathon athlete that circles the entire North Atlantic in a single year. It used to be that only a few sport fishermen were interested in the giant bluefins, although there was a minor commercial catch of the smaller ones. But the prosperity following World War II was the undoing of both small and large. By the 1960s, hundreds and even thousands of giant tuna were being caught every year in contests to see which sportsman could kill the largest fish. As appalling as it was, this recreation paled beside another and even more destructive force. The Japanese prized the raw flesh of the giant bluefin above almost any other. They willingly paid extraordinary prices for this delicacy, so their affluence became the engine that has driven these great fish toward extinction. Today, they are almost gone. A few of the remaining giants are still caught and held in net traps off Nova Scotia. The small bluefins were swallowed up for canning, and the future ought to lie here with the big ones who do most of the spawning. Not these fish. They're being fattened up and sent to Japan. It would seem that the last of the giant bluefins are just too valuable to be allowed to live. devastation of cod and other groundfish took longer than the larger species and required much more sophisticated technologies. New types of sonar made it possible to pinpoint the location of the schools and to pursue them wherever they might go. The late 1960s and early 70s were years of criminal overfishing. Fleets of draggers from a dozen nations ravaged the banks. At that time, Canada had no jurisdiction over offshore waters, and there were no restrictions on this orgy of destruction. The annual catch peaked at an incredible 2 million tons. 10 years later, it had dropped by over 50%. Many species suffered drastic declines, and the bottom nearly fell out of the Atlantic fishery. Canada's extension of control over offshore waters saved many fish stocks from commercial extinction for a while. But northern cod have continued to be so heavily depleted that present catch quotas may have to be cut in half. Consumer demand far outstrips supply, but we remain unwilling to curb our appetites. Modern technology gives us the capacity to fish out the ocean and to process and package it into profitable merchandise. We treat the sea dwellers as mere commodities, not as members of an interwoven community of life. Such a narrow view strips the natural world of meaning and of dignity. Look what we've done to the lobster, a marvelous creature that has flourished since the age of the dinosaurs. Considered trash until the mid-19th century, lobsters were first commercially exploited as cheap canned food. Only when they grew scarce did they become expensive. Because of their high value, lobsters are trapped so intensively that about 70% of those available in any season are caught that season. Gourmet taste demands live lobsters, but keeping them alive was a bit of a problem. As ever, technology has found a solution. This high-tech lobster pound is designed to maximize the profits and minimize the risks of dealing in live animals. A computer automatically weighs and sorts as much as 700,000 kilograms a year. Each lobster is isolated to maintain quality, and there's less chance of disease and no chance of aggressive interaction. They're stored in here for up to 6 months, and so are available out of season when the price is highest. Very cold seawater drains into the trays, reducing the lobster's metabolism so they won't eat, lose weight, or molt their shells. Living animals, suspended in a technological catacomb. This is the heart of the paradox. We're very good at using technology for our own ends. In this case, taking what we want from the sea and turning it into profitable merchandise. But we're very bad at using technology to preserve the living world. In this case, saving the sea and life within the sea. What we've done to whales, seals, and fishes in the name of progress and profit is utterly reprehensible. And yet we won't face up to what we've done and what we continue doing. And so we choose to blame other animals for interfering with our fishing and for taking our resources out of the ocean. Our modern fishing gear is deadly efficient, like these drift nets, which trap not only the desired prey, but just about everything else. Until this salmon fishery shut down in 1976, up to 500,000 seabirds were being netted and drowned every season as a bycatch. Over 100,000 seabirds still die annually in Atlantic drift nets, together with countless dolphins, seals, sharks, and other creatures, all of them so-called incidental kills. To the fishermen, these incidental kills are a nuisance, damaging gear and wasting valuable time. They are treated accordingly. Being perceived as an enemy of our fisheries is a death warrant. Beluga whales, once abundant in the Gulf, are a prime example. In 1932, Quebec slapped a bounty on belugas. The ostensible reason was that they were destroying the salmon, a total falsehood. The real reason was to subsidize a whaling company that had already reduced the belugas to a remnant. Until 1979, belugas were still being shot as salmon-eating vermin. By that time, there were less than 350 left alive. Although protected now, these last survivors are in danger of extinction. They are being poisoned by the fish they eat in the polluted St. Lawrence. A few more bodies roll up on the shore every year. We're good at blaming other creatures for our sins. There was the beluga, and of course there are the seals, the favorite scapegoats for troubles in the fisheries. Gray seals are a particular target. Their largest population gathers at Sable Island off Nova Scotia in January to stake out territories and bear their young. Heavily hunted for oil in centuries past, the gray seal was thought to be extinct in Canadian waters until rediscovered in 1949. Making a comeback, the grays colonized 5 rookeries. But except here on Sable Island, these have all been subjected to bloody raids by the Federal Department of Fisheries. At least 16,000 pups and 4,000 adults have been butchered, and this number rises to 50,000 when bounty kills are included. Seals are being persecuted because they carry the codworm, which is harmless to man. They do some damage to fishing gear, and they are accused of eating too much fish. The truth is, we are killing too many fish. And having depleted the larger kinds, we are now taking more and more of the smaller species, upon which so many other creatures depend. If all the fish are there solely for our use, even the herring and the capelin, what place remains for seabirds, whales, seals, and dolphins? What future is for this entire marvelous web of life? The destruction of the small fish has deadly consequences. In 1981, after the capelin stocks off Newfoundland collapsed, up to 90% of the puffin chicks failed to survive their first year. In our expanding drive to profit from the wealth of small fishes, we are committing new sins, as terrible as any in the past. Every autumn, a large part of the West Atlantic herring population spawns off southern Nova Scotia. During this spawning run, over 80,000 tons are sucked out of the ocean. Catches are now less than half what they were 20 years ago, but the price is high. Over $30,000 worth pours into the hold on a good night. Despite high prices, the herring itself is worth little. This lucrative fishery exists solely for the eggs, the roe, considered a gourmet delicacy in Japan. It creates a lot of employment, turning 80,000 tons of herring into a few thousand tons of roe. But at what cost to life in the sea? The problem is what to do with the carcasses, since only the roe is really valued. A portion is turned into fish meal or fertilizer, and gulls manage to get a few, but the rest are trashed. In recent years, the roe fishery has dumped at least 130,000 tons of edible herring. Part of it at sea, part of it buried in landfill sites. Over 11,000 tons right here in just 1 year. We seem to be no wiser now than when we first sailed into the New World. Lust for short-term gain still blinds us to the consequences of our actions. It's not hard to visualize what our seas and shorelines may yet become. A wasteland where only a few scavengers prosper on the devastation we have wrought.
You've seen a few glimpses of what our culture has done to life in and near the sea. 5 centuries of greed and waste and death. And now things are getting worse. We're threatening the very fabric of life itself as we continue to pour enormous quantities of our lethal waste into the oceans. What we haven't killed directly, we are now killing indirectly.
Is there any hope? Yes. If we can find the compassion and the wisdom and the courage to act, and if we could regain control from the vested interests who have been savaging this planet for policy, for profit, and for pleasure, and if we can force our leaders to serve the interests of life itself instead of selfish interests, and if we will recognize the fact and act upon the fact that we are the most dangerous animal ever to live upon this planet, then, and then only, the sea of slaughter may again become a sea of life.